February 22, 1942, Corregidor Island, Manila Bay, Philippines. The message arrived at 1,430 hours through the static of a radio transmission that had traveled 8,000 miles from Washington. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Huff watched General Douglas MacArthur's face as he read the decoded words, watched the general's jaw tighten, watched his fingers grip the paper until the edges crumpled. The message was from General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and it carried the authority of President Franklin Roosevelt himself. It said MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines immediately, to proceed to Mindanao and then to Australia, where he would assume command of all United States troops in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur read it twice, then set it on his desk in the Malinta Tunnel, 100 feet beneath the rock of Corregidor, and said nothing for 3 full minutes. Outside the tunnel, Japanese artillery pounded the island. The shells had been falling for weeks now, 1,200 rounds some days, turning the surface installations into rubble and dust. Inside the tunnel, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of men who had not bathed properly in months. MacArthur's headquarters occupied a lateral tunnel off the main passage, a space carved from volcanic rock that amplified sound and trapped heat. Maps covered the walls, showing the steady constriction of territory, the gradual collapse of defensive positions on the Bataan Peninsula across the bay. MacArthur was 62 years old, a 4-star general who had retired from the army in 1937 to become military advisor to the Philippine government, then been recalled to active duty in July 1941 as commander of United States Army forces in the Far East. He commanded approximately 80,000 American and Filipino troops, most of them now trapped on Bataan with dwindling supplies and no prospect of reinforcement. The war had begun badly. On December 8, 1941, 9 hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers had destroyed half the American aircraft at Clark Field while they sat on the ground. MacArthur had withdrawn his forces to Bataan according to pre-war planning, declaring Manila an open city to spare it from bombardment. But the withdrawal had become a siege, and the siege was now entering its 3rd month with no relief in sight. The men on Bataan were on quarter rations. They were dying of malaria, dysentery, and beriberi. They called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan, and they sang bitter songs about being written off, about no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. Some of them sang songs about MacArthur too, calling him Dugout Doug, saying he hid in his tunnel while they fought and starved. MacArthur's wife Jean and their 4-year-old son Arthur lived with him in the tunnel. Arthur had celebrated his 4th birthday there on February 21, the day before the order arrived. There had been no cake, no candles, just a small gift and the sound of shells exploding on the surface. When an aide had asked MacArthur what would happen to the boy if the Japanese took Corregidor, MacArthur had replied that Arthur was a soldier's son and would accept whatever came. But that answer had been bravado, and MacArthur knew it. The thought of his son in Japanese hands, of Jean in Japanese hands, was a thing he could not permit himself to consider for long. Now Roosevelt was ordering him to leave. To abandon the men under his command. To escape while they remained to face capture, imprisonment, or death. MacArthur walked to the tunnel entrance and stood looking out at the bay. Smoke rose from multiple points on Bataan. Japanese artillery batteries on the peninsula were firing at Corregidor, and Corregidor's guns were firing back in a daily exchange that accomplished nothing except to mark time until the inevitable conclusion. MacArthur had known for weeks that the Philippines could not be held. There were no reinforcements coming, no convoys of supplies, no fleets steaming to break the blockade. Europe came first in American strategy. The Pacific was secondary. The Philippines were expendable. But knowing that did not make leaving easier. MacArthur returned to his desk and drafted a response to Marshall. He stated that he understood the order but requested permission to delay his departure until a moment he judged more appropriate to the tactical situation. He wanted to time his escape for maximum effect, to leave when conditions gave him the best chance of success and when his departure would cause the least damage to the morale of troops who were already near breaking. Marshall's reply came the next day, February 23. It was firmer, more insistent. The President directed MacArthur to make arrangements to leave as quickly as possible. Instructions would be provided for submarine or aircraft transport. Washington wanted MacArthur out of Corregidor before the Japanese took the island and captured the most famous American general in the Pacific. MacArthur spent the next 2 weeks planning his escape and wrestling with the decision. He told his staff he was considering refusing the order. He said he would stay with his men, share their fate, die if necessary rather than abandon his command. His officers listened to these declarations with varying degrees of belief. Some thought MacArthur meant it. Others thought he was performing, creating a dramatic narrative that would justify his departure when it finally came. Lieutenant Colonel Sid Huff, MacArthur's aide, believed the general genuinely struggled with the decision. MacArthur's sense of duty was real, but so was his understanding that one captured general would not change the outcome in the Philippines. His presence in Australia might change the outcome of the war. On March 1, MacArthur summoned Lieutenant John Bulkeley to his office. Bulkeley commanded Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, 6 PT boats that had been operating in Philippine waters since before the war began. They were small wooden boats, 77 feet long, with 3 engines that could push them to 40 knots. They carried 4 torpedoes and machine guns, and their crews were young men who had learned to fight by fighting. Bulkeley was 30 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had gotten his appointment through persistence rather than connections, and he had proven himself in the early months of the war by attacking Japanese shipping, rescuing refugees, and surviving when larger vessels could not. MacArthur asked Bulkeley if his PT boats could make a run to Mindanao, 560 miles south through waters controlled by the Japanese Navy. Bulkeley studied the general for a moment before answering. The boats were worn. They lacked spare parts. The fuel available was contaminated with water and sediment. The crews were exhausted. But Bulkeley told MacArthur it would be a piece of cake. He did not believe this, but he understood what MacArthur needed to hear. MacArthur nodded and dismissed him, and Bulkeley returned to his boats to begin preparing for an operation he knew had perhaps a 1 in 5 chance of success. The days that followed were consumed with logistics and decisions that would determine who lived and who stayed behind. MacArthur was authorized to take a small staff with him. He had to choose which officers would accompany him to Australia and which would remain on Corregidor to face whatever came next. He chose his Chief of Staff, Major General Richard Sutherland. He chose his operations officer, his intelligence officer, his communications specialists. He made a list of 19 people including his family, knowing that space on the PT boats was limited and that every person he took was a decision about loyalty, utility, and survival. Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, commanding the forces on Bataan, would remain behind to take command when MacArthur left. Wainwright was a cavalryman, a tall thin officer who had fought in World War I and who understood that he was being asked to inherit a defeat. MacArthur met with Wainwright on March 10 and explained the situation. He told Wainwright to hold out as long as possible, to fight until fighting became impossible, and then to surrender with honor. Wainwright accepted this burden without complaint, though both men knew what it meant. The forces on Bataan would collapse within weeks. Corregidor would fall shortly after. The men who surrendered would face imprisonment under conditions that neither general could predict but both feared. March 11, 1942. The escape was scheduled for dusk. MacArthur spent the morning destroying documents and personal possessions that could not be taken. He burned letters, photographs, and papers that represented years of his life in the Philippines. He kept only what could fit in a small bag. His staff worked to pack essential files and codes. Jean MacArthur packed clothes for herself and Arthur, trying to balance the need to travel light with the uncertainty of what awaited them in Australia. Arthur did not fully understand what was happening. He knew they were leaving, but he did not grasp that they might never return. At 1,700 hours, MacArthur walked through the Malinta Tunnel one final time. He stopped to speak with officers who would remain behind. He told them he was leaving under orders, that he would return with reinforcements, that the Philippines would be liberated. Some of the officers believed him. Others simply nodded and saluted. MacArthur emerged from the tunnel into the late afternoon light. The surface of Corregidor was pockmarked with shell craters. Buildings that had once housed barracks and command posts were skeletal frames of twisted metal and shattered concrete. The flag still flew above the parade ground, and MacArthur stood looking at it for a long moment before turning toward the dock. 4 PT boats were assigned to the evacuation. PT 41, commanded by Bulkeley, would carry MacArthur, Jean, Arthur, their Chinese nurse Cho, Sutherland, and several other officers. PT 34, PT 32, and PT 35 would carry the remainder of the party and essential equipment. The boats had assembled at different locations to avoid drawing attention. They would rendezvous outside the minefield at the entrance to Manila Bay at 2,000 hours, then run south through the night. The plan was to reach Mindanao in 35 hours, where B-17 bombers would fly them to Australia. It was a plan built on speed, luck, and the hope that Japanese naval patrols would not detect 4 small boats moving through 560 miles of enemy-controlled water. MacArthur boarded PT 41 at 1945 hours. He wore his field uniform and his distinctive cap with its braided visor. He carried no sidearm. He helped Jean aboard, then lifted Arthur and handed him to a crewman. The boy was frightened by the unfamiliar boat and the tension in the adults around him, but he did not cry. MacArthur stood at the bow as the boat pulled away from the dock. Behind him, Corregidor was a dark mass against the evening sky. Artillery flashed on Bataan. The sound of explosions carried across the water. MacArthur raised his hand in a salute to the men he was leaving behind, though in the darkness he could not see if anyone saw the gesture. PT 41 moved slowly through the inner harbor, navigating by the faint light of stars and the memory of channels the crew had run dozens of times. At 2,000 hours, the 4 boats assembled at the turning buoy outside the minefield. Bulkeley took the lead. The boats formed a line and increased speed, their engines cutting through the water with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of night. Within minutes, they spotted the dark shapes of Japanese ships in the distance. Bulkeley altered course to the west, threading between enemy vessels that patrolled the approaches to Manila Bay. The PT boat's low profile and the cover of darkness made them nearly invisible, but MacArthur could feel the tension in the crew. If they were spotted, they would have to fight or flee, and either option would likely result in their destruction. They passed through the Japanese blockade without being detected. By 21:30 hours, they were in open water, heading south at 25 knots. The weather was deteriorating. Swells built to 12 feet, then 15, then 20. The small boats climbed the face of each wave and crashed down into the trough beyond, throwing spray across the deck and slamming passengers against bulkheads. MacArthur went below to the crew compartment, a cramped space with no windows and minimal ventilation. Jean and Arthur were already there, along with Ah Cho and several officers. The motion of the boat in heavy seas was violent. Arthur began to vomit almost immediately. Jean held him and tried to comfort him while fighting her own nausea. MacArthur sat on the deck and let Jean massage his hands, trying to distract himself from the seasickness that was overwhelming him. The night was endless. The boats lost contact with each other in the darkness and rough seas. Each captain navigated independently, relying on compass and dead reckoning to stay on course. MacArthur had no way to know if the other boats were still afloat or if they had been swamped by waves or intercepted by Japanese patrols. He spent hours in the dark compartment, listening to the engine strain and the hull flex, feeling the boat rise and fall in a rhythm that made time meaningless. This was the darkest moment of his life, physically and emotionally. He had abandoned his command. He was fleeing through enemy waters with his family in a boat that might sink or be destroyed at any moment. Everything he had built in the Philippines, every relationship and achievement, was behind him and beyond his control. By 03:30 hours on March 12, the four boats had become completely separated. Bulkeley had no radio contact with the others and no way to coordinate their movements. He decided to proceed to the first rendezvous point at Tagawayan Island and hoped the other boats would do the same. The seas remained heavy throughout the morning. PT-41's engines were overheating. The contaminated fuel was causing problems that the crew had to address while the boat continued to bounce through swells that threatened to throw men overboard. At 0930 hours, PT-34, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Kelly, reached Tagawayan Island. Kelly sent 2 crewmen ashore to climb the 500-foot hill and watch for the other boats and for Japanese aircraft. PT-41 arrived at 1600 hours, more than 6 hours behind schedule. MacArthur stood on the deck as the boat approached the island, salt water dripping from his cap, his uniform soaked and stained. He looked older than 62, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. But when he saw PT-34 waiting, he straightened and adjusted his cap. Bulkeley brought PT-41 alongside, and the 2 boat commanders conferred about the missing vessels. PT-32 was low on fuel and experiencing engine trouble. PT-35 had fouled fuel strainers. They were both somewhere behind, struggling through the same seas that had battered PT-41. MacArthur ordered Bulkeley to wait at Tagawayan until the other boats arrived or until darkness forced them to continue without the others. PT-32 and PT-35 reached Tagawayan that evening. The submarine USS Permit had been dispatched to the island as a backup plan in case the PT boats failed. The submarine took aboard the crew of PT-32, which was no longer seaworthy, and PT-32 was destroyed to prevent the Japanese from capturing it. The passengers from PT-32 were transferred to the remaining PT boats. MacArthur had wanted to continue immediately, but Bulkeley insisted they wait until morning. The boats needed rest, the crews needed rest, and running through Japanese-controlled waters in darkness with compromised vessels was a risk that might end the operation before it reached Mindanao. MacArthur slept on the deck of PT-41 that night. He refused offers of a bunk, preferring to remain with the crew. He woke before dawn and stood watching the eastern horizon lighten. At 0630 hours, MacArthur ordered Bulkeley to depart Cagayan. He wanted to reach Mindanao during daylight when Japanese naval activity might be reduced. It was a gamble, trading concealment for speed, betting that the boats could outrun any patrol they encountered. They left Cagayan at 1430 hours on March 12, running in daylight despite the risk. Within 15 minutes, they spotted the Japanese heavy cruiser Ashigura. The cruiser was a warship that could destroy all 3 PT boats with a single salvo from its 8-inch guns. Bulkeley ordered the boats to change course, increasing speed and moving away from the cruiser. The PT boats were small enough and low enough that they did not register on the cruiser's watch. The Ashigura continued on its patrol course, unaware that Douglas MacArthur was passing less than 2 miles away. As they approached Negros Island that evening, Japanese artillery crews heard the PT boat engines and mistook them for American aircraft. They opened fire, filling the sky with flak and tracer rounds. The PT boats ran through the barrage without slowing, and again they were not hit. MacArthur stood on the deck of PT-41 watching the fireworks display, thinking about luck and fate and the narrowness of survival. At 0630 hours on March 13, PT-34 sighted Cagayan Point on Mindanao. They had spent 35 hours traveling through 560 miles of Japanese-controlled waters. Bulkeley, who had commanded his boat continuously for those 35 hours, navigated to Del Monte Airfield and brought PT-41 to the dock precisely on schedule. MacArthur stood at the prow as the boat approached, shaking salt water from his cap and setting it at a jaunty angle. He helped Jean ashore, then lifted Arthur and carried him onto the dock. Brigadier General William Sharp, commander of the Visay Mindanao Force, was waiting to greet them. MacArthur shook his hand, then turned to Bulkeley. He told Bulkeley that he was awarding every officer and man in the PT boat squadron the Silver Star for gallantry. He said Bulkeley had taken him out of the jaws of death, and he would not forget it. Bulkeley saluted and stepped back. He looked as exhausted as MacArthur felt. Both men were unshaven, their uniforms stained and rumpled, their eyes red from sleeplessness and strain. They had accomplished something that many officers had considered impossible. They had broken through the Japanese blockade and delivered the most valuable military asset in the Philippines to safety. But the escape was not complete. MacArthur waited at Del Monte for 4 days while the Army Air Forces arranged for aircraft to fly him to Australia. The B-17s that arrived were in poor condition, patched and repaired from months of hard use. MacArthur was furious when he saw them. He told Sharp that he would not board dangerously decrepit aircraft and demanded the 3 best planes in the United States or Hawaii, manned by completely adequate experienced airmen. The message was sent to Washington, and Washington scrambled to find aircraft that met MacArthur's standards. On March 17, two B-17s landed at Del Monte. They were not the best planes available, but they were serviceable, and MacArthur accepted them. He boarded the lead aircraft with Jean and Arthur. Sutherland and the others boarded the second plane. At 0900 hours, the B-17s took off and turned south toward Australia, flying low to avoid Japanese fighters that patrolled the skies over the southern Philippines. The flight took 11 hours. The B-17s landed at Bachelor Airfield near Darwin in northern Australia. MacArthur had expected to find substantial American forces waiting for him, perhaps the nucleus of an army that could be used to launch a counteroffensive against Japan. Instead, he found a small garrison and a handful of aircraft. The forces promised to him existed mostly on paper. Australia was defended by its own troops and whatever American units could be scraped together from other theaters. MacArthur's face showed nothing when he learned this, but the disappointment was profound. He had left behind 80,000 men in the Philippines believing that he would return with reinforcements. Now he understood that any return would take months, perhaps years, and would require building an army from nothing. From Darwin, MacArthur flew to Alice Springs in a DC-3, then took a train south toward Melbourne. The train journey gave him time to think, to process what had happened and what came next. He drafted statements in his mind, trying out phrases and testing their weight. On March 20, the train stopped at Tarawe, a small railway station 220 kilometers north of Adelaide. MacArthur had expected the stop to be brief and private, but when he stepped from the train, he found a crowd waiting. Locals had gathered to see the American general who had escaped from the Philippines. Reporters were there too, notebooks ready, cameras raised. MacArthur had not planned to speak, but the crowd was expectant, and he understood that this moment required something. He walked to an opening between railway carriages and stood facing the people of Tarawe. He was dressed in a loose jacket and slacks, wearing no decorations except the distinctive laurel wreath peak on his cap. He began by explaining that he had been ordered to Australia by President Roosevelt to organize an American offensive against Japan. The primary purpose of that offensive, he said, was the relief of the Philippines. Then he paused, and in that pause he made a decision. He said he had come through, and he added 3 more words that would define the rest of his war and the rest of his life. He said he shall return. The phrase was simple, direct, and personal. Not, we shall return, as Washington had requested when they reviewed his statement drafts. Not, America shall return or the Allies shall return. Just, I shall return. It was a promise made by one man to the people of the Philippines, a promise that bound him to a course of action regardless of strategy or politics or the decisions of others. MacArthur understood the power of personal commitment. He knew that wars were fought by men who believed in something beyond survival, and he was giving the Filipinos and the Americans and the world something to believe in. The reporters wrote down the words. The phrase appeared in newspapers across Australia, then across America, then around the world. It became a slogan, a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against Japanese conquest. In the Philippines, resistance fighters heard the words and began printing them on leaflets and walls. The Japanese heard them too and dismissed them as empty propaganda. But MacArthur had made the promise, and from that moment forward everything he did was directed toward keeping it. MacArthur arrived in Melbourne on March 21 to a hero's welcome. Crowds lined the streets. Australia desperately needed American help to defend against possible Japanese invasion, and MacArthur represented that help. He was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area on April 18. He established his headquarters in Melbourne and began the work of building an army, planning operations, and organizing the slow, grinding campaign that would eventually take him back to the Philippines. The men MacArthur left behind on Bataan surrendered on April 9, 1942. Approximately 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers were captured and forced to march more than 60 miles to prisoner-of-war camps in what became known as the Bataan Death March. Thousands died during the march from exhaustion, disease, and execution by Japanese guards. Corregidor fell on May 6, 1942. Wainwright surrendered with 15,000 more men. MacArthur learned of the surrenders while in Australia and felt the weight of their captivity as a personal failure, though strategically there had been nothing else Wainwright could have done. MacArthur spent the next 2 years fighting his way back across the Pacific. He commanded operations in New Guinea, capturing airfields and ports in a series of amphibious assaults that bypassed Japanese strongpoints and isolated their garrisons. He argued constantly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff for more resources, more troops, more support for the Southwest Pacific area. He clashed with Admiral Chester Nimitz over strategy, with Nimitz advocating a direct approach to Japan through the Central Pacific while MacArthur insisted the Philippines must be liberated. In July 1944, MacArthur met with President Roosevelt in Hawaii and convinced him that the United States had a moral obligation to return to the Philippines. Roosevelt approved the operation. On October 20, 1944, MacArthur stood on the deck of the cruiser USS Nashville as American forces landed on Leyte Island in the central Philippines. The beach was still under fire when MacArthur decided to wade ashore. His staff objected, arguing that it was too dangerous, but MacArthur insisted. At 1,300 hours, he stepped off a landing craft into knee-deep water and waded 50 yards to the beach. Photographers captured the moment, and the image became one of the most iconic photographs of World War II. MacArthur striding through the surf, his face grim and determined, fulfilling the promise he had made 31 months earlier at a railway station in the Australian outback. MacArthur walked to a microphone that had been set up on the beach and delivered a radio address to the Filipino people. He said he had returned. He said that by the grace of Almighty God, Allied forces stood again on Philippine soil. He told the Filipinos to rally, to rise and strike, to fight for their homes and their freedom. The words were broadcast across the islands, and resistance fighters emerged from hiding to join the American advance. The liberation of the Philippines took 8 months. Japanese forces fought with desperate determination, inflicting heavy casualties and destroying much of Manila in brutal urban combat. MacArthur's forces recaptured Corregidor in February 1945, Bataan in March, Manila by the end of March. American and Filipino troops liberated prisoner-of-war camps and found the survivors of the Bataan Death March, skeletal men who had endured years of imprisonment. Only about one-third of the men MacArthur left behind in March 1942 survived to see his return. When MacArthur met some of them, he told them he was a little late, but they had finally come. The promise MacArthur made at Tarawa was kept, but the cost was measured in tens of thousands of dead and wounded, in cities destroyed, in a population that had suffered through 3 years of occupation. MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He stood at a table on the deck and signed the surrender documents as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Wainwright stood beside him, newly freed from captivity, and MacArthur gave him one of the pens used in the ceremony. The escape from Corregidor and the promise at Tarawe defined Douglas MacArthur for the remainder of his life. It established him as a man who kept his word regardless of obstacles. It made him a symbol of American determination and perseverance. It also reinforced his belief in his own destiny, his conviction that he had been chosen for a special role in history. That belief would serve him well in the occupation of Japan, where he ruled as a benevolent autocrat and helped rebuild a defeated enemy into a democratic ally. It would serve him less well in Korea, where his refusal to accept limitations on his authority led to his relief by President Truman in 1951. But in March 1942, as MacArthur stood on a railway platform in Tarawe and spoke those three words, none of that future was certain. He knew only that he had escaped death, that he had left men behind, and that he owed them something more than survival. The promise was both burden and redemption, a commitment that would drive him forward through years of war and define how history would remember him. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of duty, honor, and the fierce determination of a man who refused to accept defeat as final. He said he shall return, and the saying made it so. If this story touched you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and comment. We bring you forgotten moments of history, decisions made in darkness and uncertainty, and promises kept despite impossible circumstances. These stories are important because they remind us that history is shaped not by the flow of fate, but by the choices of individuals. Thank you for listening.